On the 2nd of June 2026, at its annual developer conference, Microsoft's Windows chief stood on stage and announced something that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. More than 75 Linux commands, the exact tools that Linux users have run on open-source systems for 30 years, were now built natively into Windows, not hidden inside a compatibility layer. Not requiring a virtual machine, just there, on Windows, working exactly the way they work on Linux. Commands like ls, grep, cat, cp, mv, rm, the verbs of Linux computing, now running natively on the operating system whose former CEO once called Linux a cancer. Windows chief Pavan Davuluri framed the announcement as part of a broader push to make Windows a trusted platform for development, but the subtext is harder to miss. Microsoft has spent 25 years fighting Linux, marginalizing it, spreading doubt about it, and funding campaigns designed to slow its adoption. And now the company has concluded that the best way to keep developers on Windows is to make Windows speak Linux. That is not a product update. That is a concession. And if you understand the full history of how Microsoft got here, the internal memos, the billions spent on FUD campaigns, the antitrust battles, and the very specific moment when the company's president stood at a podium and said the words on the wrong side of history, then this announcement looks less like innovation and more like the final chapter of a war Microsoft lost. I am going to show you exactly when that war ended, what it cost, and what it means for anyone sitting in front of a Windows machine right now wondering if things are finally different, because they are. Just not in the way Microsoft would prefer to describe. Let me give you the number that anchors everything else in this story. In 2020, Microsoft's president Brad Smith said publicly, "Microsoft was on the wrong side of history when open source exploded at the beginning of the century, and I can say that about me personally." The president of Microsoft, on the record, at an MIT event, admitting the company got it wrong. This was not a casual comment. Brad Smith had been at Microsoft for 25 years by that point. He was not an outsider criticizing the company's past. He was one of the senior lawyers who had fought in the legal battles surrounding open-source software. He knew exactly what he was saying, and he said it anyway. In 2001, then CEO Steve Ballmer had described Linux and open source as a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. That was the public position, cancer. A legal and intellectual threat to be contained and defeated. And yet, at its Build 2025 conference, Microsoft open-sourced the Windows subsystem for Linux, the component that runs a full Linux kernel inside Windows, after nearly a decade of development, with community contributions growing to over 200 pull requests per month. And then, 1 year later at Build 2026, more than 75 Linux command line utilities running natively on Windows, built from the utils open source project, a cross-platform re-implementation of GNU core utils written in Rust. Commands like ls, cp, mv, rm, and cat running natively on Windows without requiring WSL or a virtual machine. From cancer to native integration in 25 years. That trajectory tells you something important about the actual balance of power in computing right now. And the specific steps that got us here, each one a quiet admission that the previous position had failed, are the story most coverage of this announcement is missing entirely. To understand what the Build 2026 announcement actually means, you need to understand the war that preceded it, and that war has a very specific timeline. In 2001, Steve Ballmer called Linux a cancer. This was not a slip. His concern was not only Linux, but open source licenses in general. The fear was that code released under open source licenses would legally contaminate proprietary software that touched it, threatening the intellectual property model on which Microsoft's entire business was built. The company spent the years that followed acting on that fear in increasingly aggressive ways. Microsoft funded the SCO Group's legal attack on Linux, a prolonged lawsuit that attempted to establish that Linux infringed on Unix copyrights. It ran public campaigns questioning Linux's total cost of ownership, commissioning studies designed to show that Windows was cheaper than it appeared. It pressured governments and enterprises to stick with Windows rather than switch to open-source alternatives. Microsoft's opposition to open source was at times rather extreme and unpleasant. That is the polite version, from a technology publication that covered all of it in real time. Then Satya Nadella became CEO in 2014. After Nadella took over, the company's views on Linux took a complete reversal. In 2014, Microsoft open-sourced the .NET framework, something that would have been unthinkable during Ballmer's tenure. The shift was not immediate or clean. It happened in stages, each one a little further than the last. Microsoft joined the Open Invention Network, the patent pool created to protect Linux from intellectual property attacks, an organization that existed partly in response to Microsoft's own earlier campaigns. It acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion. It open-sourced Visual Studio Code. It began contributing to the Linux kernel. The Windows subsystem for Linux was first announced in 2016, offering a way to run Linux command line tools and utilities directly on Windows without a virtual machine or dual boot setup. When it launched, it felt experimental. By 2025, it had become foundational. The question was always how far this would go. Build 2026 answered it. The turning point is not Build 2026, it is a GitHub issue that was opened on the 6th of April 2016, the same week WSL was first announced. Issue number 1 in the WSL repository. The question, will this be open source? That issue sat open for 9 years. Developers commented on it, updated it, watched it. It was a living document of a promise Microsoft had not yet made. And then, at Build 2025, Microsoft closed it. Microsoft, at its Build event, announced that the Windows subsystem for Linux was now open source after almost a decade of development, with community contributions already growing significantly even before the source code was published. The company had closed issue number 1 in its GitHub issue tracker, the 9-year-old question of whether WSL would ever be open source, with a yes. By open sourcing WSL, Microsoft opened it up to direct contributions, feature development, and bug fixes from the broader community, acknowledging that WSL could never have been what it is today without its community, even without access to its source code. Think about the significance of that statement. The community built major features for a project whose code they could not see. They contributed to a compatibility layer between Windows and Linux entirely on trust and reverse engineering. And when Microsoft finally opened the code, it acknowledged that it was already theirs, in spirit. That is what winning looks like. Not a formal declaration, not a press conference, a 9-year-old GitHub issue getting closed. 1 year later, Build 2026 took the next step. The announcement of core utils for Windows was less a novelty than a concession to reality. Modern development already speaks Linux, even when the laptop runs Windows. Microsoft's pitch is no longer that Windows developers should stop thinking in Unix-shaped workflows. It is that Windows can become the place where those workflows live without apology. That is a complete reversal of the position held for 20 years, and it happened in public, with no acknowledgement of what it represents, which is why someone needs to say it clearly. The Core Utils announcement matters on its own terms, but it becomes more significant when you see it as part of a pattern that has been accelerating for several years. Core Utils for Windows includes commands like cat, cp, find, grep, hostname, ls, mv, pwd, rm, sleep, t, and uptime. The project is based on the open-source utils project, a cross-platform rewrite of GNU Core Utils in Rust, and is designed to make it easier for developers to switch between Linux, macOS, Windows, and WSL without changing workflows. The Rust-based foundation is worth noting. Microsoft did not write these tools from scratch. It built on an existing open-source project and packaged it as a native Windows feature. The decision to build on the utils project is telling. Instead of wrapping GNU binaries or shipping a compatibility layer that smells like a one-off port, Microsoft is using a Rust-based, cross-platform reimplementation with technical credibility. Alongside the Core Utils announcement came another one that received less attention: WSL containers. a built-in way to create, run, and interact with Linux containers on Windows, providing native CLI and API tools for container workflows without requiring third-party tooling. Docker, the dominant container platform, has long been the tool of choice for developers running Linux containers on Windows. Microsoft just built an alternative into the operating system itself. The reason all of this matters to the audience of this channel, Windows users who feel betrayed by Microsoft, who are curious about Linux, who have been watching the relationship between these two operating systems shift in real time, is what this escalation implies about the next few years. Microsoft is not doing this because it discovered a love of open source software. It is doing this because developers have been leaving Windows or avoiding it because the development workflow was increasingly Linux native and Windows kept getting in the way. Every workaround a developer had to set up, every time they had to reach for WSL because native Windows didn't speak the language they needed, was a moment where Windows failed to earn its place. For developers who have spent years context switching between Windows and Linux environments, the message from Build 2026 is unambiguous. Microsoft is done asking you to choose. That is a company that ran out of road on the strategy of forcing that choice. Here is what this arc looks like for a specific person. Imagine a systems administrator in his late 50s. He spent 20 years managing Windows Server environments for a mid-sized company. He knew the Microsoft ecosystem deeply, group policy, Active Directory, PowerShell, the whole stack. He was good at it. And then, over the course of roughly a decade, his company moved its infrastructure to the cloud. The servers went to Azure, and what ran on Azure, increasingly, was not Windows. Microsoft Azure reported 61.8% Linux virtual machine usage across active subscriptions in 2025. Even the cloud platform Microsoft built and sells runs primarily on Linux. He had to learn a new language in the second half of his career. Not by choice, not because he went looking for something new, because the industry moved, and the tools that the industry moved to were Linux tools. grep, bash, SSH, the command line that Microsoft had spent decades treating as beneath the dignity of a modern operating system. The irony of the Kurutil's announcement is that for this person, and for millions like him, it arrives after the fact. He already learned the Linux command line. He already built the muscle memory. He already made peace with the fact that his Windows expertise, while still valuable, no longer described the totality of the work. And now Microsoft is putting those commands into Windows and presenting it as a feature. The cost was not just the learning curve, though that was real. The cost was the years of friction that the gap created. Every time a script that ran on Linux had to be rewritten for Windows. Every time a tool that worked in Bash had no equivalent in PowerShell. Every time a developer had to explain to a manager why the development environment and the production environment spoke different languages. The Windows subsystem for Linux papered over the gap brilliantly, but it also preserved the idea that real Unix-like work happened inside a Linux box, even if that box was only a lightweight layer inside Windows. The gap was real. It cost real people real time and real frustration. And for some of them, the ones who got tired of explaining it, who switched to Linux or to Mac OS and never looked back, this announcement is simply too late. The honest read on what Microsoft has done here involves both genuine credit and genuine skepticism. The credit first. Building 75 Linux commands natively into Windows is not trivial engineering. Core for Windows was built from the ground up as a native implementation, not a repackaged compatibility layer, compiled natively for Windows and designed to respect Windows path conventions, line endings, and performance characteristics. Microsoft has pledged to maintain and update it alongside Windows. That is a commitment, not just a press release. And the decision to open source WSL, after 9 years of pressure to do so, was a genuine change, not performative. Community contributions to WSL have grown to over 200 pull requests per month, which means developers trust the project enough to contribute to its future. The skepticism is also legitimate. Microsoft has a documented history of the strategy, its own internal documents named Embrace, Extend, Extinguish, Adopt an Open Standard, Add Proprietary Extensions, make the proprietary version the default. The Halloween documents, the leaked internal memos from 1998, describe this strategy explicitly. The question any experienced observer has to ask is whether what we are seeing now is genuine convergence or a more sophisticated version of the same move. When Microsoft puts Linux commands inside Windows, it keeps developers on Windows. It keeps them paying for Windows licenses, running Windows Update, subject to Windows telemetry, and dependent on Microsoft's decisions about what Linux functionality to include and what to leave out. Some commands that conflict with existing Windows built-ins were excluded. Others were dropped as not useful in the Windows environment. A longer list of POSIX-only commands like chmod, chown, and crt are simply not applicable to the Windows environment. The version of Linux inside Windows is always going to be Microsoft's version of Linux, curated, bounded, maintained on Microsoft's schedule. That is a real limitation for anyone who needs the full power of an actual Linux system. But for the audience sitting in front of a Windows computer wondering whether Linux is relevant to their life, whether the shift in the industry has any practical meaning for them personally, the Build 2026 announcement is a clear signal. The company that called Linux a cancer has now embedded Linux's DNA into its operating system. You do not do that because the cancer lost. Come back to the 2nd of June, 2026, a stage at Microsoft Build. A Windows chief announcing 75 Linux commands built natively into Windows, a Linux subsystem open sourced to the community, and Linux containers built directly into the operating system. In 2001, the CEO of this company called Linux a cancer. In 2020, the company's president said Microsoft was on the wrong side of history. In 2026, the company shipped Linux's vocabulary as a core Windows feature. That is not innovation. That is the conclusion of a 25-year argument. Linux won the argument. Microsoft updated the product to reflect that. For the people watching this channel, Windows users who feel the relationship with Microsoft has changed, who have been curious about Linux but unsure what it means for their own lives, the next video in this series goes further into what core utils for Windows actually includes, which commands work best, what is still missing, and whether this changes the practical calculus for someone sitting on Windows 10 wondering what to do when support ends. Because the announcement is real, the limitations are also real. And understanding both is how you make a decision that actually fits your situation. If that is the kind of analysis you came here for, no agenda, no cheerleading, just verified facts about what these tools do and do not do, subscribing is how you get the next piece when it arrives. Not as a number on a counter, as a continuation of the same investigation,